Welcome, everybody. It's not the sunniest day, so it's wonderful to be here with all of you. And a very special welcome to David Wilson. Many people are looking forward to hearing you because, as you know, we've got quite a large attendance today. If there's a new member who is with us for the first time, special welcome to you as well. So I am going to be your host today, and I'm also going to introduce David. So the first thing I need to tell you is that you are all muted. I just doing that. Yes, you are. All right, that is done. And to now ask you, a lot of you are used to this. You go to the top of the screen, right hand, there's a little icon, and you press on speaker view. And that is going to be very important, of course, when David is giving his talk. Everyone is all set, wonderful. So I'm going to introduce David Wilson. David is a professor in the history department and Celtic studies at the University of Toronto. And you know, he is what every assistant professor should strive to be. He is an outstanding teacher and he is an exceptional researcher. Indeed, he was awarded the University of Toronto Outstanding Teaching Award, and having over the years nominated a few people for this award, I know how difficult it is to get them. David specializes in modern Irish history and the Irish in Canada. He's the author of several books, notably a prize-winning biography on Thomas D'Arcy McGee. Now, volume 1 got the Raymond Kilbanski Prize, and volume 2 of the biography won the Canadian Historical Association Political History Prize. His most recent book, which sounds fascinating. I mean, David, you have a knack for titles. There's no doubt about it. Listen to this, everybody. Spies and Informers, Irish Revolutionaries and the Origins of the Canadian Secret Police. And that is forthcoming with Miguel Queen's Press. Now, since 2013, David has been the general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, and he's going to speak to you about the biography, about what this dictionary is, rather. But having gone online, preparation for this lecture, I can tell you that it is absolutely remarkable from many, many points of view. So, on behalf of everyone, I welcome you, David, to Senior College and ask you to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Janet. The titles don't always work, I should add. I have one edited volume entitled Ulster Presbyterians in the Atlantic World, which my wife thought should be renamed Ulster Protestants, Ulster Presbyterians in the Atlantic World, brackets, oh dear, close bracket. But thanks very much for inviting me. In a different universe, we would have been having lunch at the faculty club, and maybe afterwards, a number of us would have retired for drinks and more discussion and diversion and conversation. But this is the situation we're in, and I'm very happy to be here, even if it's not under the circumstances that we'd all like. You mentioned, Janet, in your invitation to me that I'd be speaking to a vibrant group of retired professors. Since I plan to join the lists of retired professors in a couple of years, and since I wish very much to be part of a vibrant group, I felt that this was an invitation I could not possibly refuse. So thank you very much for that. When when I came to Canada as a landed immigrant in 1974 and started at Queen's University to do my master's in history the following year, I had no notion whatsoever of Canadian history. It was a new world to me. I wasn't taking Canadian history at Queen's. That came much later. Uh, and it would be fair to say that I didn't have so much an indifferent attitude to dictionaries of national biography, but actually I had a negative attitude towards them because I associated them with fairly dull and tedious compilations of the facts of the lives of great men. And there is some element of truth to that for some entries in some dictionaries. So it became somewhat ironic that many years later I'd become general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, by which time, of course, I had a very, very different view. I share your view, Janet, that it's an absolutely fascinating piece of work that is of immense use to historians, the general public, with close to 9,000 biographies. Um, it's a terrific resource for us all. So, so what I'd like to do now is, well, just take a journey into some of the more interesting and unusual and surprising stories in the dictionary. And this talk is going to take the form of a series of narratives. And then perhaps afterwards in the Q&A, we can talk about some of the broader and deeper issues, such as the place of narrative in historical analysis, such as the changing nature of historical biographies and their relationship to the broader social context, such as what constitutes a good biography and a less than good biography. These are all issues that I won't be addressing directly in my talk, but which I would love to discuss with you afterwards. So the first story I'm going to tell you is the story of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography itself. It goes back some 60 years or so to an unlikely beginning from an unusual man, a man by the name of James Nicholson, an Englishman who made his fortune in Canada as a bird seed manufacturer and who was determined to give something back. And his passion, when he wasn't selling birdseed, was reading. And he became fascinated by Canadian history, so much so that in his youth, he'd sometimes go without food to buy books. And in the course of his reading, he was struck by the fact that while his native country, England, had a dictionary of national biography, it was central to the world of English history, his adopted country had no such thing. So he set out to give Canada a dictionary of its own. And if you can get rich selling birdseed, you can do just about anything. He bequeathed $3 million to the University of Toronto for the project. That's about the equivalent of 25 million in today's money. His dream was to create a dictionary of Canadian biography that would not simply rival, but surpass its English predecessor. It was a dream, I think, that came true because 8,500 biographies later, the Dictionary of Canadian Biography won the Governor General's Award for Popular History. When the Pulitzer Prize winner, David Hackett Fisher, wrote his biography of Samuel de Champlain, he wrote that, quote, by comparison with the first British Dictionary of National Biography and the original Dictionary of American Biography, the DCB DBC is superior in coverage, documentation, and quality of writing. As you can imagine, we're rather fond of that quotation of the DCB DBC. Right from the start, James Nicholson insisted that the dictionary must encompass not just the rich and famous, my graduate student presupposition, they would be included, of course, but would encompass people from all walks of life, from all parts of the country, English and French. In 1961, the University of Toronto and Université Laval in Quebec agreed to make the dictionary completely bilingual. And so it became and remains the major bilingual project in the Canadian humanities. I've written for other dictionaries of national biography, and this is the kind of experience I've had for the American National Biography and for the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. You write your piece and it's around 800 words to 1,000 words. In my case, it could be longer. And you might get a reply asking you how much the person left upon his or her death, what were the conditions of the will. Questions that I could never answer, in fact. But that was it. Those of you who may have written for the Dictionary of Canadian Biography will know that it's a very, very different experience. When a biography arrives in our office, first of all, it'll be a biography written by an expert in his or her field. It'll be a biography based on primary sources, and that's absolutely essential for us. The biographies must be written by experts, and they must be based on primary sources. And then they're subjected to rigorous fact-checking, rigorous editorial scrutiny. When you've been edited by the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, you know that you have been edited. And I'm proud to say that we have some of the finest editors in the English and French speaking world. I am just so impressed with the editors that I have met at the DCB and the DBC. And they ensure that the biographies meet the highest standards of research and readability. Nothing gets past them, nothing. And then all the biographies are freely available online. And that marks us out from our counterparts in Britain and the United States and Ireland. We don't restrict readership to those who can afford subscriptions. We're open to everyone. Now, the absence of subscriptions also can be a drawback because it means that we have fewer resources to draw on than other national biographies have. We don't have the same kind of financial backing that they have through their subscriptions and indeed through government support. But we're not going that route. Accessibility is a central principle for us. Another issue here is that we're not as far ahead as we'd like to be. Most of our biographies focus on people who died before the 1950s. And we would love to move more rapidly towards the present, just as we would like to revise some of the biographies written long in the past. That would be an interesting subject for discussion afterwards, particularly considering biographies written about Indigenous peoples in Canada. We have many of them, but I think many of them need to be reconfigured. We also want to take full advantage of the possibilities opened up by digital technology. And indeed, once the DCB went online, it reached a much greater audience than ever before. It's been a huge opportunity for us. And there are still areas in which we're working there to work more closely with schools, to establish a more visible presence on the web. This takes us into the arcane world of Google Analytics, which I don't really understand. But then again, one of the earlier editors of the DCB, Francis Halpenny, didn't know how to type. So you don't have to know everything. But my staff know a lot about Google Analytics. It terrifies me. I'm very much a product of the last century. But the aim, to paraphrase Jeremy Bentham, is to bring the greatest number of biographies of the highest possible quality to the greatest number of people. That's our aim, the greatest number of biographies of the highest possible quality to the greatest number of people. So this is a wonderfully Canadian story. I mean, it's the story of an immigrant with a dream and plenty of birdseed who helped us to understand our past, to understand each other, to bring French and English together in a common cause, and to remind us of our collective strengths and weaknesses and our individual strengths and weaknesses. Even James Nicholson, though, couldn't have imagined the stories that we've published. And so 6 of them I'm going to share with you this afternoon. And they were hard to select. There are a lot of people that I could have included. Perhaps we could discuss that in the Q&A as well, but for reasons of time and space have not. They're not typical, and in a sense that's the point. They feature people who do not normally appear in dictionaries of national biography. They're people whose lives illustrate relatively unknown aspects of our history. My guess is that most of you won't have heard of any of them. My hope is that after you hear their stories, you won't forget any of them. All of them are women, all of them surprise, and some of them shock. The first is known simply as Alice G. I can't tell you her real name. It has to be withheld for legal reasons. Historian Jeffrey Rome from York University wrote her biography for us. Alice G was born in 1854 near the Bay of Quinte, and we don't know much about her early life. She had, it was said, a good English common school education. Her religion was Anglican. She was single. She didn't drink. She worked as a housekeeper. She was also mentally disturbed, a condition that was said to have been triggered by disappointment in love affairs. She became fixated on a local doctor, claiming that he'd made her pregnant, that she would give birth to 2 babies, one made of gold, one made of silver, and that she was a prophetess who would live forever and perform miracles through prayer. She also had suicidal tendencies, telling a neighbor, quote, that it was a good thing there were rivers about so that she could put an end to herself, unquote. So what happens to someone like Alice G in Canada during the late 19th century and early 20th century? This. In 1893, at the age of 39, she was committed to Toronto's Asylum for the Insane. The asylum was designed to hold 700 patients. By the time Alice arrived there, it had over 1,000. For 16 years, she lived in a locked public ward, which was cold in the winter, infested with rats, and devoid of such basic comforts as cushions or carpets. Then they moved her to another building, where she remained for the rest of her life. For most of her 45 years in the asylum, she worked every day in the laundry. She was a good worker, they said. Work was supposed to be a form of moral therapy. That at least was the theory. Moral therapy that would improve your psychological condition. In practice, it meant paying residents who paid could exempt themselves from doing chores, which meant that the poorest patients, the Alice G's of this world, did most of the work. It was supposed to be light work, but it wasn't. She did the ironing. That involved heavy lifting in a hot, steamy environment. That was the only kind of therapy, moral or otherwise, that she ever received. Alice G never tried to escape. She never had any visitors. She was described variously as very affable and very peculiar because she talks and smiles away to herself. She was always on the move around the building, heard strange voices, and sometimes got into fights with fellow patients. During her last years, she wore, quote, old rags and soiled clothes pinned to her dress, items that she might have taken from the laundry. She died in 1938 at the age of 84. 11 years earlier, someone at the asylum asked her why she was there and reported her reply. She claims she is here by mistake, unquote. Alice G, someone I think who would have remained lost to most Canadians had her story not been told in the DCB. I want to move back now more than a century. I want you to meet a very different kind of woman. Very different. I'll begin by telling you a story about a common theme in Irish and Scottish ballads from the late 18th century and the early 19th century. I'm a great lover of traditional music, and I enjoy this world immensely. And in this theme, two lovers, and they're generally known as Willy and Nancy, two lovers are about to get married when the dreaded press gang arrives and unceremoniously carts Willy off to sea. Nancy, not to be deterred, decides to follow him. So she dresses herself up as a sailor or a cabin boy. She smears her fingers with a touch of tar. She signs on board and she starts to look for her Willy, so to speak. Meanwhile, the captain, much to his surprise, finds that he has strong feelings of affection towards this new cabin boy and begins to experience a crisis of sexual identity. All is revealed, though, when there's a skirmish on the ship. The buttons fly off her jacket and her snow white or lily white breast, depending on the song, appears for all to see. The captain reaffirms his heteronormativity, although of course he doesn't quite put it like that. But where is Willy in the story, in the ballad? At this stage, it becomes apparent that perhaps Willy wasn't worth following after all. You might even conclude that he'd arranged the press gang himself to escape the marriage. In some versions, the captain tells Nancy to get up early the next morning, where she'll find Willy walking along with his lady gay, whom he just happened to have married the previous day. In others, Willy finds out that she's after him and is really upset. So much so, in fact, that he and his mates plan to do her in. But Nancy is not the kind of woman you want to mess around with. According to one variation on the theme, she takes out a brace of pistols and promptly dispatches Willy to an early grave. According to others, the captain steps in and threatens to throw Willy overboard. Either way, she comes out pretty well of the situation. At the very least, she's rewarded with her own vessel, sailing out to the Isle of Man. At the very most, she winds up living as the highest captain's wife in Canada I.O. So why am I telling you this? Because the cross-dressing woman is nothing if not resourceful. Instead of lamenting cruel fate, the phrase, the expression in the ballads is sad lamentation, which I love, as opposed to happy lamentation. Instead of lamenting cruel fate, she goes out and she makes things happen. Nor is she entirely fictional. Here is the true story, insofar as we know it, of Isabel Gunn from the Orkney Islands in Scotland, as related by Sylvia Van Kirk in the DCB. Sylvia Van Kirk, who wrote a book, Many Tender Ties, on the relations between Scottish fur traders and Indigenous women. Like Alice G, Isabel Gunn had a disappointing love affair, but there the resemblance stops. It was the summer of 1806, and the men were boarding ships to work with the Hudson's Bay Company in the far north of British North America. Among them was Isabel's lover, who had done a runner and left her behind. Well, Isabel was having none of that. She determined to go out there herself and track him down. And then Well, then we don't know exactly. Bring him back, ream him out, shoot him with a brace of pistols. The HBC ships only boarded men, but Isabel was not to be deterred. She disguised herself as a boy and signed on as John Fubister on a 3-year contract at £8 a year. They landed at Moose Factory, where she was transferred to Fort Albany, only to learn that her lover was serving at Eastmain in Quebec. But since she was now John Fubister with the HBC, she carried on and made the best of it. In the fall of 1807, they sent John Fubister to Pembina, now on the Manitoba, North Dakota border, where he worked at anything and well like the rest of the men, quote unquote, until on the 29th of December 1807, something surprising happened. As the men were heading out for the customary whiskey-soaked holiday celebrations, Fubister told the head of the HBC post, Alexander Henry, that he wasn't feeling well and asked to stay at his house. Alexander Henry takes up the story. Fubister was extended out upon the hearth, uttering most dreadful lamentations. He stretched out his hand towards me, and in a pitiful tone of voice begged my assistance and requested I would take pity upon a poor, helpless, abandoned wretch who was not of the sex I had every reason to suppose. But it was an unfortunate Orkney girl, pregnant and actually in childbirth. In saying this, she opened her jacket and displayed to my view a pair of beautiful round white breasts. An hour later, she gave birth to a son. The father was apparently one John Scarth, not the man she'd been looking for, but a long-time HBC employee who had sailed with her and shared her secret, and a lot more, it was evident. At this point, Isabel Gunn assumed a third identity, Mary Fubister. They sent her back to Fort Albany, and Isabel, who'd been doing a man's work, worked at anything and well like the rest of the men, unquote, in Pembina, was now given a traditionally female role as a washerwoman. She did not want to return to the Orkneys, but it was against company policy to allow white women at any of its posts. And so in September 1809, she was discharged from the company and sent home with her son by the annual ship. I wish I could tell you that she became the highest captain's wife in Canada IO, but that kind of thing, it appears, only happens in the songs and the ballads. No one knows. No one knows what became of her or her son. But oral traditions in the Orkneys say that she suffered further misfortune and ended her life as a vagrant. All right, I think it's time for a story with a happy ending. Insofar as we can have happy endings in a dictionary determined by death dates. This one, written by Charlene Porcil, is about a young girl who at the age of 15 emigrated with her mother and sister from County Cork in Ireland to North America. This is an Irish-Canadian story I did not know about, although I've been working in the field, until I became general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. The woman in question is Ellen Cashman, or as she would become known, Irish Nellie. They arrived in Boston, Nellie and her mother, they arrived in Boston in 1860. 9 years later, the two of them crossed the continent to San Francisco. There was gold in the hills. Neither Nellie nor her mother saw any good reason why it should only be mined by men. So in 1873, they joined an otherwise all-male party of 200 prospectors bound for the gold mining district of Cassiar in northern British Columbia. And they kept a boarding house for miners, and they went prospecting themselves. She decided to sit out that winter, 1873-4, in the warmer climate of Victoria, where she heard that the mining camp up in the Cassiar was in deep trouble. The men had run out of supplies, and there was an outbreak of scurvy. So she persuaded 6 very reluctant men to join her on a relief run. And they made the journey for 77 days. They trudged through deep snow, surviving avalanches, extreme temperatures, and violent storms. She nursed the scurvy victims, distributed food and supplies, and spent the next 2 years in the Cassiar. While there, she also helped to raise money to build St. Joseph's Hospital in Victoria. The press soon got hold of the story, and Irish Nellie became something of a celebrity. She had verve, courage, and a keen sense of humor, and was a woman in a man's world. The miner's angel, they called her, or the angel of the Cassiar. In 1876, she followed the silver to Tucson and then to Tombstone, establishing her own restaurant, a grocery, a boarding house, a hotel, a boot and shoe store, raising more money for charities and helping out those in need. Miners who fell on hard times would be sheltered and fed without charge. The miner's angel. When Tombstone went bust in 1886, she upped stakes and set out on a prospecting tour. And this is just one line in the biography. And there's a book to be written here. She set off on a prospecting tour that took in New Mexico, Idaho, Wyoming, Mexico, South Africa, and new camps in Arizona. And then in 1897, news comes through that gold has been discovered in the Klondike. Some 30,000 prospectors headed for Dawson, Nellie Cashman among them. She got there too late to stake a claim on the richest ground, but the one she bought on Bonanza Creek brought in over $100,000, which is a hell of a lot of money in 1897. I spent every red cent of it buying other claims and prospecting the country, she said. I went out with my dog team or on snowshoes all over that district looking for claims. Meanwhile, she also operated a restaurant and a grocery store in Dawson's Donovan Hotel. All but one of the other hotels were run by men. 99% of the miners were men. Nellie Cashman was truly exceptional in every sense of the world. She was still prospecting in her 70s. No retirement for her, vibrant or otherwise, until at the age of 79, an Alaskan winter got the better of her, and she died of double pneumonia. She was one of the most remarkable women in the West. In 1994, she was featured in a United States postage stamp. In 2014, a monument to her was erected in her hometown of Middleton, County Cork. She has not been similarly honored in Canada, but she does have an entry in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. Cross-dressers, angels. Now to gangsters. Here's the story of an equally energetic woman who also excelled in a world of men, but a much darker person in a much darker world. Bessie Starkman, Canada's first female organized crime boss. Her biography was written by the photo editor and CBC producer Robin Rowland. Born in Russian Poland in 1889, Bessie Starkman came with her family to Toronto around 1900. She lived in the ward, and she worked, as many women did, as a seamstress, in this case in an Eaton's sweatshop. She married a Russian named Harry Tobin, but in 1912 met a young immigrant from Calabria named Rocco Perry. Within a year, Bessie abandoned her husband, abandoned her children, and abandoned her Jewish faith, and shacked up with Rocco, eventually moving to Hamilton. Her first brush with the law came in 1917, when she was charged with keeping a disorderly house, a euphemism for a brothel. I had no idea what was going on, she claimed. The judge was not convinced. The real opportunity to make money came not from prostitution, but from liquor. In 1916, Ontario went dry. Quebec, being Quebec, did not. And there was no law against the interprovincial movement of liquor. This was a bootlegger's paradise. And it got even better in 1920 when the United States adopted prohibition. And the following year, a court in Windsor ruled there was no Canadian law against the export of liquor. So Bessie and Rocco became part of a Calabrian gang that sold massive amounts of liquor and beer to Ontarians and Americans. And Bessie quickly rose to the top. She placed orders with distilleries and breweries. She laundered the money and handled the bank accounts. She dealt with other gangsters on liquor and drug deals. She paid gang members. She paid bribes. She started wearing expensive clothing and jewelry. She let everyone know who was in charge. On one occasion, Rocco promised compensation to a member of the gang who'd been killed by the police. When the man's uncle came to collect the money, she told him to go to hell. Not exactly the way to win friends, but Bessie Starkman wasn't interested in doing that. By the late 1920s, when the Ontario government eased up on liquor restrictions, the bootleg market collapsed. So what does a smart entrepreneur do under those circumstances? Why, diversify, in this case, to drugs. Bessie Starkman became the leading drug dealer in Ontario and probably in Canada. It didn't last long. On August 13th, 1930, as she and Rocco were leaving the garage of their home, Bessie was killed in a hail of shotgun blasts. Nobody knew, or more accurately, nobody said, who did it and why. One theory was that she'd alienated so many members of the gang by ordering them around and refusing to pay expenses that they took it upon themselves to kill her. Another was that Rocco, who was not killed during this attack, had been in on the plan because she'd broken too many mob customs. And a third was she'd reneged on a drug deal with gangsters from Rochester, New York, who'd shot her. No arrests were made. After her murder, the Perry Empire went into steep decline, a negative indicator of her power within it. As for Rocco, 3 years later, he started living with another strong woman, Annie Newman, who helped him revive the fortunes of the gang. But it never became as dominant as it had been under Bessie Starkman. And Annie Newman is not in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. The next story I want to tell you has some contemporary resonance, given the Helen Naslund case that you may have read about in Alberta. Robin Urbach wrote an article about it in the Globe last Saturday. This is a story of Angelina Napolitano. Angelina Napolitano, described in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography as a homemaker and convicted murderer. I can't do better than give you the opening of her biography as related by the historian who wrote it, Franca Iacovetta. On the afternoon of Easter Sunday, 16th of April, 1911, in the upper flat of a house in the immigrant quarter of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Angelina Napolitano, 28 and pregnant, killed her husband. As he slept, she struck him 4 times on the neck and head with an axe. After calling a neighbor to tell him what she had done, she waited for the police, hugging the youngest of her 4 children. And continuing the story. Why did Angelina kill Pietro? The evidence strongly suggests that she had become terrified of a violent husband bent on forcing her into prostitution. An underemployed laborer, he had wanted money to build a house. At the trial, it was revealed that Angelina's face, neck, and shoulder had been disfigured in November 1910 when he knifed her 9 times. Charged with assault, he had received a suspended sentence. The abuse continued, And on the fateful day he had again told Angelina to prostitute herself, or, as she put it, be a bad woman. If she did not have money for him when he woke up, he threatened to beat or kill her. At the trial, McFadden, her lawyer, argued that Angelina had been provoked into murder by her husband's abuse, most notably when he had stabbed her the previous year. But the judge ruled such evidence inadmissible, saying that if anybody injured 6 months ago could give that as justification or excuse for slaying a person, it would be anarchy complete. The jury found her guilty with a recommendation of clemency. The judge ignored the recommendation and sentenced her to death. But he postponed the execution for later in the year, after she'd given birth to the child she was carrying. Her case quickly gathered national and international attention and became the focus of an intense debate about immigration, domestic abuse, and the legal system. For some people, the murder was a vivid illustration of the way that foreigners were corrupting Canadian life. The local newspaper, the Sioux Star, called Southern Italians hot-blooded foreigners who were all too ready to use the knife, the pistol, or any other weapon that lies at hand as a means of redressing real or fancied wrongs. Another article said she deserved to die because she was immoral. When her husband had been out of town, it pointed out, she'd permitted a man to board with her. On the other hand, many people, mainly on the left, took up her cause. Petitions to have her sentence commuted came in from Canada, the United States, England, and even Austria and Poland. Her case became a feminist cause célèbre, as women who are demanding the vote argue that Angelina was acting in self-defense after all the beatings and abuse she'd received. Some regarded her as a heroine who should be applauded for helping to rid the world of, quote, loathsome ulcers, unquote, such as her husband. Others argued that the terrors of the death sentence would damage her unborn innocent child. One Canadian MP even argued that her pregnancy had produced temporary insanity and that the sentence should be commuted on that ground. In the end, the Canadian government bowed to the pressure and Angelina was not hanged. Her child died a few weeks after birth. When she was released from Kingston Penitentiary in 1922, she tried to find her other children who'd been placed in foster homes. It is not known whether she succeeded. And finally, Anna Peel, who was known informally in our office as the Mother from Hell. She was born in 1865, Ulster Protestant parents. At the age of 21, she married William Smith Jury, who was 64 and who was rich, or so she thought. They had two children, Arthur, born in 1881, and Helen, born 2 years later. William died shortly afterwards, leaving Anna short of money. That did not stop her, though, from enrolling Arthur in Upper Canada College and Helen in Bishop Strachan. Anna was convinced that Arthur was destined for greatness, even though he struggled at school and settled into a humdrum life working in a bank. All that changed, though, when he went overseas with the Canadian Army to fight against Germany. Anna followed him to England, and she petitioned British, French, and Red Cross officials to allow her to volunteer as a nurse so that she could look after him on the Western Front. To no avail. After he was wounded at Ypres, she pestered the Canadian Minister of Defence to get him a staff position. But Arthur refused to accept it and insisted on remaining with his battalion. Gradually, writes biographer Veronica Maddox, he was able to slip from his mother's stifling emotional embrace, unquote. He would stay with the battalion, he said, and when the war was over, he would not go back to the bank. But he never saw the end of the war. He was killed in December of 1917. And then the story takes an unexpected turn. After the war, she was determined to bring his body back to Toronto. The authorities refused. There were some 60,000 dead Canadians. You couldn't set a precedent by starting to repatriate their remains, even if you could identify them. And if you did set that precedent, only the rich could afford it. There would be inequality in the face of death. Besides, most soldiers said that if they died, they wanted to be buried with their men. None of this cut any ice with Anna Peel. She tried everything, even ambushing the Prime Minister, Arthur Meehan, when he was staying at the King Edward Hotel. So she decided to go ahead anyway and do it herself. Anna and Helen, helped by two local men, exhumed his corpse from the British cemetery in July of 1921. It didn't go well. When the body was hoisted onto a cart, the horse shied and snapped the shafts, got pierced by the wood and couldn't go on. Back into the grave went the corpse. This was in northern France, by the way. 4 years later, they tried again. They hired men to open up one end of the coffin and drag out what survived of the corpse, leaving behind fragments of bones and clothing. And then they put it in their luggage and carried it across the Atlantic. For 3 days, it lay in state in the front room of her house on St. George Street. The French government were furious and wanted to prosecute. The British and Canadians thought legal action would do more harm than good and let the matter drop. Anna did everything she could to make sure that Arthur would be remembered as a great man. She wrote a book of poems about him, in which he was transformed into an aristocratic hero whose daring deeds helped win the war. She erected an 8-foot cross of sacrifice at his new grave in St. James's Cemetery. And if you go to St. Thomas's Church on Huron Street, just a few yards up from the DCB offices, you'll see a plaque to Arthur Peel's memory. So 6 surprising women with 6 remarkable stories. It's misleading to look for patterns, given that I've chosen them precisely because they're unusual. What they do illustrate, at the very least, is the diversity of experience of women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the period on which I focused, with the exception of Isabel Gunn. 2 of the women, Ellen Cashman and Anna Peel, were of Irish origin. The former very, very Catholic, the latter very, very Protestant. One, Bessie Starkman, was from Russian Poland. Another, Angelina Napolitano, was from Naples. They were part of the new wave of immigrants coming into Canada at the turn of the century, with all the opportunities and all the fears that movement produced. Isabel Gunn was Scottish. Alice G's origins are unknown. If their origins are different, their experiences diverged even more, and they reflect various aspects of Canadian life. Conditions in mental asylums, the world of gender bending, cross-dressing, fur traders. Admittedly, a small world, at least I suspect a small world, but a fascinating one nonetheless. A world of real gold diggers, such as Irish Nellie, and metaphoric ones, such as Anna Peel. A world of organized crime, and a world of domestic abuse and retaliatory self-defensive violence. 6 stories out of our current total of 8,800. So I changed my mind from my days as a graduate student when I thought dictionaries were dull and boring and only dealt with rich and famous great men. I also changed my prejudice when I came to this country But I thought, compared to the revolutionary periods I'd been studying in France and the United States and Spain and Latin America in the late 18th century and early 19th century, I thought Canadian history was exactly what they said. It was quite boring. On the contrary, on the contrary, on the contrary, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. I would love to get in, as I say in the Q&A, to discuss, I'll discuss anything you like, obviously, but I would love to get into the broader and deeper questions of meta-narratives and the place of biographies in historical analysis and changing approaches to biographies, and indeed to dictionaries of national biography. But I fear I've taxed your patience enough at this stage. I'm sure that 5-minute break will be very welcome. So I'll see you in 5.